Story 1. I'm a young man who likes other guys, living in a not very big town. Finding someone to date here is not easy, and most of us use apps or websites to meet people to hang out or date. Every day I check these sites hoping to find someone new to talk to, but I almost never meet anyone. I'm always a little scared of getting sick or being cheated, so I just look around without really planning to meet someone. About half a year ago, while searching on Craigslist, I came across an ad that caught my eye. It was from a man a little older than me who seemed to be looking for the same thing I was. I wanted to hang out with someone my age, maybe have a few drinks together and just enjoy each other's company, not just look for something quick. After responding to their ad, we exchanged text messages for a month but never talked about actually seeing each other. Finally, I felt brave enough to ask if he wanted to meet. He said yes, and we planned for me to drive to his house, which was about 16 miles away from me, out of town. On the day we were supposed to meet, it was getting late, around 6 p.m. It wasn't completely dark yet, but it was getting to that point. I drove to the area where he said he lived. He texted me to tell me he'd be on the side of the road because he was coming back from a friend's house and asked me to pick him up on his way home. He had mentioned before that he had 2 children living with him since his mother was not around. He told me that his kids were at a friend's house that night, so we'd have the place to ourselves. As I got closer, I saw him walking down the road, carrying a large speaker and wearing a hoodie. We were far from the city, on a dirt road with a few houses scattered here and there. I stopped the car and greeted him, trying to be friendly. But he didn't smile or say anything, he just opened the car door and sat down. I found it odd because we'd been chatting nicely for a month and I thought it would be more welcoming. After picking him up and starting to head to his house, he suddenly asked me to turn around. I wanted to pick up some drinks and things to relax together. I didn't think much about it and turned the car around. Driving back through the dark, unlinked road, he mentioned that his house had no electricity and asked if that was okay. I was a little surprised, but I said it was okay if I had candles or something for the light. He didn't answer, he just looked straight ahead. That made me think about his children. How can children live in a house without power? I asked myself. So I asked him about it. At that point, things took a darker turn. He casually mentioned, "They're with my mom now." But just days earlier, he insisted that his children were living with him and their mother was not in the picture. My mind was filled with doubts, but I didn't feel directly in danger, not at the time. When we arrived at the store, he covered his face and head, as if trying to avoid being seen by anyone. This behavior seemed strange to me. He returned to the car after buying his things. On our way back to his house, about 15 minutes away, he dropped a bombshell saying, "I had to sell drugs to pay for the night." I was surprised by his sudden admission. Sensing that the situation was getting riskier, I asked about protection just in case. I didn't have any, so I suggested we stop at another store to buy some, hoping that this detour would offer me a chance to escape. His actions were getting stranger and stranger, and all he wanted was to find a way out. Leaving it at the supermarket felt like my chance. I considered leaving and cutting off all contact with him. But as I thought about leaving, I remembered his big speaker in my car. I didn't want to have any ties to him, fearing that he might accuse me of theft, so I decided to take the speaker out of my car. But as I was doing so, I heard, "What are you doing?" He had caught me in the act. Panic invaded me. I quickly lied, "Just making room for you in the front." Surprisingly, he seemed to believe my clumsy lie. However, now I was back in my car and my chance to leave was gone. Driving further into the dark, far from any sign of life, the eerie silence of the road was only broken by the rays of my headlights. I asked if we were close as my navigation indicated that we should have arrived. He dismissed it saying, "Oh, that's an old business address. My house doesn't appear on maps." Alarms rang in my head, fear gripping me with thoughts of being robbed or worse. I slowed down the car, desperately looking for some way to escape this growing nightmare. I quickly made up a story that my best friend was waiting for me soon for a few drinks. I explained that I didn't know we would go that far and that I was already late. I wasn't sure if he believed me, but I added that I had texted him the address he had given me so he would know when to expect me back. He seemed to accept my story but was clearly upset. Then he suggested, "Why don't we have some fun in the car right now? There's no one around here, no one will see us." I replied firmly, "No, I really can't. My friend is already upset and called me while you were at the store. I promised him I'd be back in 30 minutes. At that point, I was prepared to leave my car behind if he showed any signs of threatening me, as long as he didn't have a gun. Thankfully, he just sighed heavily, got out of the car, and as he leaned over to say something else, I accelerated quickly, leaving a cloud of dust behind me. I couldn't see him in the dark through the rearview mirror, but I imagined his reaction. Once safe, I called my friend, my mom, and my sister, telling them an abbreviated version of what had happened. The thought that I might have been in grave danger made me emotional. Back home, curiosity took over me and I looked for the address he had given me. Not far from there was a lonely house, located at the end of a dead end. Using Google Street View, I saw that it was abandoned, without a door and in poor condition. Searching for the actual address revealed that it had been put up for sale 5 years ago and had yet to be sold, likely due to its deteriorated condition and possibly its murky story. My friend speculated that he might have planned to take me there, away from any possible help or passing cars, making it a perfect place for foul play. After this experience, I vowed never to meet anyone from Craigslist again, unless it was in a very public and safe place such as a police station parking lot. Despite my initial vow to stay home, the obligations of life, school, and work made that impractical. I'm fine now, but the incident was a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk when you least expect it. Story 2. I was at the Megamart store. It wasn't a dream job at all, but it paid the bills. For 2 long years, I was behind the counter, dealing with all kinds of difficult people. Customers were yelling at me, pushing me against the cash register, touching me inappropriately, and even an elderly woman gassing at me because she was upset about how the store was pricing oranges by the piece rather than by weight. Yes, that really happened. But the incident I can't forget happened on a day like any other at Megamart. I had barely started my shift when I noticed a line of about 10 people forming up at my checkout. This store was always busy, and for some reason there never seemed to be enough boxes open. This made people feel really frustrated and impatient when it was their turn. So I did the best I could, put a smile on my face and made small talk with customers as they arrived. Most of the time, customers just wanted to pay and leave without really being interested in chatting. So I found myself going through the motions, scanning the items mechanically. Then this man came up with only 2 things: yogurt and bandages. I quickly scanned them and packed them neatly. But the man was acting strangely. He didn't look at me or respond when I said hello. His gaze was fixed on the conveyor belt, as if he was lost in thought or just not there at all. I noticed that the conveyor belt was a little dirty since I hadn't had a chance to clean it. The moment I got behind the checkout, people started queuing. When I told him that his total was around 1,532 pesos, he began to look for the exact change in his pockets, even without making eye contact. His hands looked dirty and rough, affected by the cold. He poured a mixture of coins onto the counter without giving me a glance and began to count them. The silence around us felt heavy. I could feel the impatience of people waiting in line, all their eyes on me except for the man, who was now digging into his trouser pockets. He was about 30 cents short. After checking it, I told him that it was missing. That was when he finally looked at me, his face all wrinkled in confusion or perhaps anger. His eyes were so dark, almost black, looking at me as if he thought I was cheating on him. I counted the coins again under his gaze. Only 30 cents are missing. Maybe you could leave something behind? Losing my job for a small discount wasn't worth it. Others had asked for it before, usually in jest. But he was being serious. No, I need these things, he insisted, his gaze becoming more intense. I wished he would just look away. His gaze was unsettling. If he had 30 cents with me, he would have paid them just to avoid this confrontation. When he tried to grab the bag, I pushed it away on the conveyor belt. It may have been a reckless act on my part, but I couldn't let him take the things. A 30-cent shortcut would get me in trouble with my managers. Just use your discount, he demanded, raising his voice. I shook my head, looking toward the other customers for some support. They watched, but no one intervened. To them, this was a mere nuisance while I was genuinely scared. I had pointed out a manager, but they never responded quickly. I called a manager, but it will take a minute, I said, trying to stay calm. He complained about the small amount and his need for the items, but eventually left, collecting his coins and leaving the shop very angry. Feeling a mixture of relief and tension, I continued my shift in a more anxious silence. After that incident, the day went on as if nothing had happened. My workday ended at midnight, and for once I managed to leave on time. I usually called my mom to take me, but she was out of town and it seemed too late to bother anyone else. Not wanting to spend on a taxi, I decided to walk home. It was only a 20-minute walk and the streets were usually empty at that hour, which made me feel safe. However, a few minutes into my walk, I noticed a car following me at a snail's pace, well below the speed limit of 50 kilometers per hour. A wave of uneasiness came over me and I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that there might be a harmless reason for this. But the car kept following me without making any movement to overtake or stop. After what seemed like an eternity, the car finally turned into a neighborhood. My relief was brief when the driver parked and started running toward me. To my horror, it was the man in the store, the one who bought yogurt and bandages, still wearing that dirty brown jacket, looking at me with those deep, dark eyes. Terrified, I turned and ran, but he followed, the sound of his pockets changing clearly. He remained silent, and in desperation I sped up, risking slipping on the icy sidewalk. Had he been waiting for me since my shift ended? Seemed that way. Glancing at him as I tried to keep up my pace on the slippery road, he suddenly spoke, asking an inappropriate question about my underwear. Disgusted and frightened, I yelled at him, calling him a filthy man, and managed to hit him. It hurt, but it made him stop. I thought I heard him say okay before he kept running, too scared to look back and not daring to take him home. Eventually I got home, taking an hour, and immediately informed my landlady about the incident, asking her to call the police if she saw anything suspicious. Unable to communicate with my mom and still shaken, I watched Disney movies until I calmed down enough to sleep. The next day, I reported the incident to the managers at my job, but they showed no concern. In hindsight, I should have called the police, but at the time, I naively thought the administration would have suggested it if necessary. Their indifference angered me, especially since they insisted that I work my shift even when I feared the man might return. I resigned shortly after. 10 years have passed since then, and I doubt I would recognize the man if I saw him again. But I'm relieved that I didn't find him again. Growing up, I was always the odd one out, which made finding friends a real challenge. Story 3. In high school, I was quite rebellious, and living in a town where everyone seemed to be excessively correct and religious seemed like a nightmare to me. Then I met a boy named Gaston. I was thrilled to have someone I could actually talk to. We quickly became inseparable, spending almost every day together. Gaston was a little strange, but then so I was too, so I didn't think much of it. We often smoked marijuana together, so I attributed some of the weird things he said to just being high. But one day he mentioned, "I think I might hurt someone soon." 4 days later, he made a threat on social media to attack our school. When I confronted him, he took it as a joke, but the school took him very seriously. The police got involved, but somehow he wasn't charged. His parents confiscated his phone and sent him away for a few weeks to calm down, but we kept in touch. It was then, foolishly, that I realized that I was in love with him. I went out of my way to defend her name, even arguing with some parents online. My own parents pleaded with me to break off relations with him, but I couldn't shake the belief that he was fundamentally a good person. I refused to think that I could really hurt anyone. But the incident at the school never really went away. When Gaston returned, other students were literally running away from him in the hallways, and he received numerous threats. His reputation was destroyed. After that, something changed in him. He became more aggressive. Even when we were chatting and laughing, he would suddenly attack me with harsh words. If I mentioned a guy I was talking to, he would insult me, or if I made a new friend, he would do everything he could to sabotage that friendship. And for some reason, I convinced myself that I was simply being too protective. A year has passed since those events. The hurtful words kept coming and I just put up with them. Despite being in love with him, I never acted on my feelings because Gaston was my closest friend. To distract myself, I started dating a guy named Fabricio. Gaston could not bear Fabricius. He didn't have a specific reason. He just didn't like her spending time with anyone but him. Fabricio was dedicated to marijuana and Gaston knew it. Gaston asked if Fabrizio could give him some marijuana on credit because of our close friendship, and Fabrizio agreed. But Gaston never returned the money. Fabrizio tried to talk to Gaston about the money, but Gaston always avoided him and avoided any confrontation. After a month of this, Fabrizio saw Gaston's car in a fast food restaurant and decided to confront him. Seeing Gaston, Fabrizio, who had a quick temper, grabbed his baseball bat as he got out of his car. Gaston panicked when he saw Fabrizio and the bat, driving quickly and calling the police, claiming that he was attacked. Fabrizio was arrested for assault with a weapon. 3 days after leaving, Fabrizio saw Gaston in his front yard. Fabrizio shouted an insult at him and left. Gaston called the police again, and this time Fabrizio was accused of harassment. At that time, my parents caught me smoking. I chose to be honest and told them everything. Understandably, they were furious about the mess he was in, especially after learning that he was involved with someone who dealt drugs. They took my phone away from me the moment I got home and forbade me from seeing Fabrizio after his release. They also installed a tracker on my phone to monitor my movements and considered informing Gaston's parents about our drug use. He knew that this could lead to Gaston being kicked out of his home if he was caught again. I secretly used my phone to warn Gaston about the possible call from my parents, and he exploded with anger. He insulted me deeply, saying that he wished we had never met. That was the last thing for me, and I told him we shouldn't talk anymore. My parents ended up not calling theirs. After that, Gaston and I left all communication. I made sure we weren't put on the same shifts at work, and at school I kept my distance. Avoiding it was easier since we didn't have classes together, but the nasty rumors he spread about me, claiming I was hooked on drugs and peddling inappropriate images, made it difficult. Then the messages began. He bombarded me with texts non-stop, so I blocked his number. But he did not give up. He would borrow phones from others to contact me, forcing me to block those numbers as well. Then he turned to messaging apps we used for work, which I also blocked. Eventually, he was fired for manipulating tips on receipts. I kept blocking any new numbers or accounts he used to try to contact me, not wanting to have anything to do with him. He even created new social media accounts to message me, but I ignored all his attempts. One afternoon, I had a guitar lesson that went on. I expected to find an empty parking lot except for my teacher's car, but I was surprised to find Gaston's car as well. How he knew I would be there, I still don't understand. Noticing that his car was empty, I mustered up the courage to go inside for my lesson. Afterward, I found his car parked right next to mine with him inside, ready to confront me. As soon as he saw me, he started shouting insults at me, leaving me paralyzed. I managed to get into my car on the passenger side to avoid passing by him and drove home as quickly as possible. He didn't stop there. He began asking others at school to persuade me to talk to him. I never gave in to talk to him, no matter how hard they tried to convince me. Just hearing his name sent me into such a state of panic that I often had to leave school. The situation got so dire that I missed all of November and eventually switched to homeschooling. About a month after the change, I was driving to get some food with a friend when the car behind us started flashing its lights aggressively. It was Sean's car, recognizable by a unique sticker on its windshield. My friend silently admitted that she had noticed him following us since we left a store, but she didn't want to scare me. Fearing for our safety, I tried to ignore him, but he parked his car in a way that looked like he was waiting for us to leave. Panicking, I quickly left my friend and ran home. Convinced by my parents, we decided it was time to get the police involved. An officer came, and I provided all the evidence I had of Sean's harassment, including the recent follow-up incident. My friend corroborated my story, but we chose not to press charges. We simply filed a report. For a while, things seemed to calm down until Sean contacted my dad on social media with outrageous claims about me. My family knew the truth and forwarded these messages to the police, who warned Sean to cease all contact. Despite his warning, I kept noticing his car following me and receiving anonymous messages. I began documenting each incident without committing myself further. As the situation escalated, I decided to support Gaston's legal defense to expose Sean's manipulation. Fortunately, the charges against Gaston were ultimately dismissed, in part thanks to my testimony against Sean. The odyssey is not really over for me. I still get random messages, but I stopped documenting them. Switching to homeschooling allowed me to graduate early and move for college, putting physical distance between Sean and me. Last I heard, Sean was arrested for something unrelated a few months ago, but I don't know the details. It's a sad conclusion to what was once a deep friendship, and an even sadder reflection on how someone I once loved became a source of constant fear. It's a reminder of how quickly people can change and become unrecognizable from the person you once knew. Story 4. What happened to me? He was around 23 years old at the time. Back then, I worked in a posh place where elderly people lived, something like a hotel but for the elderly. My job was to be at the front desk from late into the evening, taking calls from people who lived there, their families, and others who were thinking about moving. Usually, by 9 p.m., everyone who lived there had finished their dinner and activities for the day and had returned to their rooms to sleep. It was a quiet night like any other. I was reading a book at the desk, waiting for the person who would relieve me at 11 p.m. so I could go home. It was around 10 p.m. when the phone rang. The screen showed unknown as caller identification, but this wasn't unusual, so I wasn't worried. I answered the phone as usual. The man on the other end of the phone sounded like he wasn't young but not old either, maybe middle-aged. He said, "Hi, I'm calling for my mom. I'm interested in seeing where it fits and knowing more about it." I started telling her about what we offer here. The different levels of care, the meals, how we have a bus to get out, fun activities, and nurses available all the time. At first, he seemed friendly and normal, but then the conversation got really strange. She mentioned, "I took my mom to get her nails done today. Do you like to do your nails?" I was a little confused by the question, but I said yes and mentioned that we have a lounge here for that kind of thing. Then he said, "My mom is here now, moving her feet in her sandals. Listen to this." Then I heard a strange soft noise. It sounds like when you walk down the beach with wet feet and then put on rubber sandals. I didn't know what to say about that. The man continued, "Did you hear that? She looks so cute. She has her toenails painted red and is wearing her sandals." By then, I was feeling really uncomfortable and wishing the call would just end. Sometimes we record calls and I didn't want to get in trouble for hanging up on someone. So I kept talking and gave him the number of the marketing department, telling him to call during the day. Finally, I managed to finish the call. When the night shift person arrived at 11 p.m., we joked about the strange talk he had had. I went home and went back to work the next day as usual. But then around 10 p.m. that night, the same man called again. This time he said, "Hi Jane, I have more questions about your place." I asked him if he had spoken to our marketing team, but he said no. He told me that he preferred to talk to me because it was nice to talk to me. I still didn't want to just hang up because I was afraid of getting in trouble. Then he started talking about nail care again, and I could hear that weird soft noise in the background. He asked, "What color are your toenails?" That was enough for me. I hung up on him. Almost immediately the phone rang again. The screen said unknown caller. I took a deep breath. Hoping it was someone else, I replied. But he was wrong. It was him, the nail care man, and this time he was angry. He yelled, saying that he would complain to my boss about how I treated him. I quickly lied, saying, "Sure, go ahead. You know we record every call, right? Then my boss can listen to them himself." There was a brief silence, then a click. He had hung up, but he called again the next night. This time he apologized for yelling. She mentioned that she still wanted to bring her mom to see our place and asked for the marketing number again. I gave it to him, hoping that would be it. On my next day off, however, things got stranger. The person covering for me said that the same man called several times over the weekend, always at 10 p.m., asking specifically for me. He wanted to know when I would be working and insisted on talking only to me, saying that I was very nice. Now he really was scared. I decided to tell my boss everything. We tried to listen to the call recordings, but it turns out that our system doesn't save calls from unknown numbers. For about a month, I was constantly worried that this man would just show up since he knew where I worked and had figured out my schedule. Following my boss's approval, I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers. One night I wasn't there, he called and was directed to my boss's phone. I'm not sure what was said because my boss didn't share the details with me, but after that, the call stopped completely. I really hope that was the last time I heard from that haunting man with a strange fascination. Story 5. I've been working at a big box store in Texas that sells craft stuff for almost 2 years now. Last year we joined our team with a new guy. Let's call him Morrow. Morrow was quite quiet at first, but soon he began to talk a lot. After a few weeks, I just couldn't stop talking. He often said strange things. Like that time I was trying to put together a chair and I was having difficulty. He joked about getting hurt if he couldn't get it right. Then, there was this day when we were both sorting items in the back room, and he mentioned how much he thought he looked like the criminal Mauricio Cruz. It was really strange. I mean, who says things like that? I remember tonight after my shift, I was outside waiting for a friend to pick me up. Suddenly, Morrow approached from behind. He just stood there, smiling awkwardly. Trying to be polite, I asked him, "What's wrong?" He replied with a vague one, "Oh, nothing major. But let's back up a bit." Before all these strange moments started happening, Morrow was just another coworker. Everyone tried to be nice to him, thinking he was shy or needed time to adjust. But as the days turned into weeks, his demeanor began to stand out more and more. Not just the strange comments, but also their actions. For example, I had this habit of staring at people from across the room. Not just a quick glance, but a long, intense look that made everyone uncomfortable. And not only at work. I heard from a couple of colleagues who saw him around the city, always alone, always observing people with the same intense gaze. Things took a darker turn one night. It was a Friday and the store was about to close. I was in the back, checking the inventory when I heard something fall in the next hallway. Thinking it was Morrow playing, I called his name, but there was no answer. I walked over there and what I saw made my blood run cold. During my lunch break, I was thinking of buying some Taco Bell food. Then, Morrow made a disturbing joke about walking into Taco Bell and hurting someone with a knife. He took it lightly, saying he was just joking. But when my partner picked me up, we saw him walking towards Taco Bell, giving us a very strange smile. The moment that really affected me was when Morrow and I had to work together on organizing the new products in the store on a large cart. We started early in the morning and were supposed to finish by noon. But by 11 we were far from finished because Morrow was still playing. He deliberately worked slowly, taking one item at a time for the cart. Our manager was very upset when he saw our progress, saying that we would both be in trouble if we didn't finish on time. I was really upset and Morrow noticed. He seemed sorry for causing trouble and apologized. Then he said something that really alarmed me. In the most serious voice I'd ever heard from him, he said, "If I ever get fired, I'm going to go back and shoot this place." He claimed that he knew where all the emergency exits were and would start with the cashiers before targeting the rest of us. I didn't report it right away, but after talking to my partner, I decided to tell my manager. They wrote down everything I said and called the police. 2 days later, Morrow was fired and arrested for his threats. At a staff meeting after the arrest, our boss told everyone what had happened. Afterwards, he shared with me what Morrow had said to the police during the interrogation. Morrow had admitted his threats and kept asking if I was the one who had reported him. Weeks later, while I was working, a man asked me for help with paint. He knew my name even though he didn't have my ID on it. His knowledge of my name and his sarcastic tone made me suspicious. He kept asking personal questions while I helped him, and even after I walked away, he kept calling me. Later, a coworker mentioned that the same man had been asking about me, asking if I was a good worker and if she appreciated me. This has happened a few more times, and I've begun to suspect that this man might be related to Morrow. They resemble and share the same unsettling feeling. This may not be the scariest story, but for me it's been a pretty spooky experience. Story 6. My wife and I were taking care of an apartment block in a small town, away from the noise of the city. We had our own place in the back, away from everyone else. Most of the people who lived there were fine, but one night, close to midnight, our dog Max started barking like crazy at the glass back door. I got up to see what was going on and saw a guy standing a little far away just looking at our house. I tried turning our outdoor light on and off to get his attention, but he didn't budge. I decided to grab my gun, open the door, and just sat there with it, watching it until it finally walked away. I called the police, but it didn't lead to much. 3 months later, after watching a movie, we returned home. My wife ran in, probably to use the bathroom. He was locking the car when she ran out, scared and crying. He said there was a man looking out of our bedroom window. I ran to our place and saw him leaning near our window. I told him to get out, but he just stood there watching. Even when I screamed, he didn't move. Then he showed a knife. That's when I pulled out my gun and pointed it at him. My wife had already dialed the police. The moment he saw the flashing lights, he ran away. Story 7. In my early days after graduating from college, I didn't have a lot of money, so I had to rent an apartment with someone else whom I had never met before. He became my roommate and his name was Randall. At first, he seemed easy enough to get along with. He didn't speak much, but he had a strong Spanish accent. The room I would have was already furnished, and that was one of the attractive factors of this apartment. There was a single bed in one corner, a good-sized chest of drawers, a wardrobe and a TV cabinet in another corner of the room. There were a lot of stuffed animals on the dresser, which I found a little odd, especially a large teddy bear in front of the bed. When I asked Randall about stuffed animals, he let out a very loud laugh and said that his room had the same thing. He recommended that I leave them where they were as a sign of respect to the owner. I didn't really talk to Randall much that first day, except to unpack my stuff and set up my TV. That night, when I was lying in bed watching TV, I thought I heard something. It was a very brief noise, but it was definitely audible and sounded like some kind of small electronic component. I chalked it up to a noise from the house and continued watching my show. The next day, Randall wasn't home all day. I didn't know if or where he worked, but I just assumed he was at work. That night, when I was in my room watching TV, I heard the front door open and Randall walking down the hallway to his room before closing the door. A little later, while I was changing into my pajamas, I heard the same sound as the night before, this time without the noise of the TV in the background, so I heard it much clearer. It was definitely some kind of electronic device, but I didn't know what it was or where it was. It still didn't seem like a big deal, so I crawled into bed and started reading my current book at that point before I went to sleep. The next day, I saw Randall when I got home from work and he asked me what book I was reading. At first, I didn't understand the question, but then he said he was talking about the book he was reading in my room. I looked at him silently, confused. I asked him how he knew he was reading a book and he said, in his heavy Spanish accent, that he had to come into my room just to take out something he left there, and that's when he noticed the book. I politely asked him not to come back into my room. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lock on the door, so I couldn't stop it when I wasn't home. That night, when I grabbed my book from under the bed, I stopped and wondered how I could see my book if I had it under the bed. Thinking about this now gave me chills and I didn't feel like reading anymore. I looked around the room while thinking to myself, and then I noticed that big teddy bear on the dresser again. He was now angled so perfectly to look at me in bed. Then I had a thought, a terrifying thought. I got up and walked over to the bear, grabbed it and looked closely into its eyes. I felt my heart skip a beat when I realized there was a camera in one of my eye holes. I threw the thing into the corner of the room and went to Randall's door and tried to open it. His door apparently had a lock because it wouldn't open, but I knew he was there. I knocked on the door shouting his name, but he didn't answer. I saw the light filtering through the bottom of the door go dark when I assumed he turned off the light. I went back to my room and called the owner. I explained everything to him and told him that I was leaving right now and that I had a valid reason to cancel the contracts. I packed some things I brought in my car and left that same night without looking back. Surprisingly, the owner didn't even come to charge me the money for those few days I was there. Since that night, I have a phobia of teddy bears. I always have to turn them around so they don't look at me. Story 8. It's the year 2016. Our new neighbors invite our family over for a late-night barbecue. My mom, dad, sister, and I met in his backyard around 8 o'clock. This is the first time I've met them personally. There is only a husband, a wife, and a teenager. I quickly learned that the boy's name is Jeremiah. The husband seems to be the kindest of all. There is something strange about the wife and the son. Jeremiah seems to have some sort of mental or social problem because he doesn't talk at all, constantly looks around, and seems to be very sad or melancholy. I also see him looking at me several times. Each time I feel more and more uncomfortable around him and I try even more not to look at him anymore. After eating a hamburger and hot dogs, our parents practically talked to Jeremiah's parents. I wait a bit before sneaking back to our house because I was bored and uncomfortable. The next day I walked to school as I lived 2 blocks from the high school. I turn my head as I pass our neighbor's house and see someone jumping behind a tree as if they were hiding. I turn around and start walking faster. I get to the last block before school and turn around again. This time I see the same person hiding in a bush in front of someone's house. It's Jeremiah. I can tell by his long hair, and he's staring at me. I walk as fast as I can without running and get to school without problems. A minute later, when I get home that day, I tell my parents and they go talk to the neighbors. When my parents talk to me again, I learn that Jeremiah is apparently not like the other children, according to his parents' words. It also seemed to be enough of an explanation for my parents, who tell me to just ignore it, as if following me to school wasn't an extremely creepy thing to do. Later that night, after texting friends and things like that in bed, I finally put my phone down at the desk and roll over to sleep. A certain amount of time goes by that I can't remember before I hear a click in my window, and then suddenly my window slides open without even knowing who's there. I scream at the top of my lungs, and soon my parents run in while I'm pressed against the wall in shock, as someone climbs through my window into my room. My parents turn on the lights, revealing Jeremiah holding a large kitchen knife. Everyone is screaming, including my father, as he comes in and grabs me out of the room. The four of us run to the neighbor's house to tell them what has happened. The man next door takes us to our own house and grabs his son when he finds him in the living room. He takes the knife out of his hands and takes him out of the house. My dad sends us all inside while he stays outside yelling at the man next door. Moments later, he goes back inside and calls the police to get a restraining order. My dad promised those neighbors hell if they didn't move out by next week. The police come and take Jeremiah, probably to some kind of place for people with mental disabilities, not to a regular jail. Fast forward a week later, Jeremiah was no longer in that house. We don't know where it stays now, but we've never seen it since. Story 9. The story was by far the scariest thing that has happened to me in my life. I went to a bar with my friends on a Saturday night, as we used to do. We were all pretty intoxicated, and the night turned into a complete blur about an hour after we arrived at the bar. I vaguely remember talking to some guys who came up to me, but I didn't remember anything out of the ordinary. I lived within walking distance of the bar we were at that night, so I guess when I got tired or bored, I left. I remember walking home that night. I think that's when I started to detox a bit. We used to leave a key under a flower pot on our doorstep. I always used that key on nights like this so I wouldn't have to walk around with my keys while drunk. I got home, closed the door behind me, and went straight to my room to fall into my bed. I skipped changing my pajamas and brushing my teeth and that. I lay awake in bed with my phone in my hands, texting my friends to see if they were still there and making sure they got home safely. Suddenly, I heard the front door open downstairs. The only thing I thought was that it could be my little brother coming home, since he usually arrived very late. My best friend texted me asking me how I got away from the guy. I replied, "What guy?" And she said, "The stalker who kept talking to me at the bar." The bar was such a blur that I couldn't remember which specific guy he was referring to. I heard some noises downstairs and assumed my brother was having a late-night snack in the kitchen. I heard footsteps going up the stairs and assumed my brother was going upstairs. My best friend texted me another saying she saw him leave the bar right after me. I was still quite drunk, but I became suspicious. The footsteps went up the stairs outside and stopped outside my door. Then the door opened silently. It was also dark outside the room, so I couldn't see who was standing at my door. I said my brother's name and then the door closed, but I didn't hear whoever was going to walk away, so I thought he was standing outside my door. I immediately texted my brother asking if it was him. Amazingly, he immediately responded by saying, "What, me? Why do you keep opening the front door? We live with our mom, she's the only other person in the house, but she was out for the week, so I didn't know what to think, other than she was an intruder." I called the police without telling my brother, and hearing 9/11 for the first time in my life really made the situation seem much more serious. I described what I thought was a home invasion, and while I was on the phone, I leaned over, turned on the lamp in my room, and as the room went from dark to bright, I saw a man standing in the corner of the room by the door. I screamed and screamed while I was still on the phone with the operator of the 911, who kept asking me what was wrong. The man in the corner opened the door and fled the scene. I heard him running toward the front door. I stayed in line with the operator, who advised me every move I should make until a police car actually arrived. He was still drunk, so the information I gave in the police report probably wasn't the most accurate, but I described the man as being in his mid-20s, stocky, bearded, and with short hair. One of the two officers raised his hand revealing a key he was holding and said he found it in the front door lock. It was the spare key that we kept under the pot. The intruder had used it to get in, which meant that he had followed me home and seen me take the key out from under the flower pot. The officer assured me that he would patrol near the area all night and advised my brother and I to keep our doors locked and find a new hiding place for the key. The next day, aside from my hangover, I was relieved. I told my friends what had happened and they described everything in detail. A creepy-looking guy at the bar had been following me all night, trying to talk to me at every opportunity, and somehow I hadn't noticed. I took a long break from going to bars and we don't hide a key outside anymore. Story 10. About 4 years ago, when I was in my 20s, I had an encounter with a guy who would become my supermarket stalker. He was standing outside the store collecting money for the Salvation Army's Christmas donations. I'm a pretty friendly person, so I like to say hello to people who work in the places I frequent to be friendly. This guy was my age, very tall, and bore a slight resemblance to Lurch from the Addams Family, dark circles under his dark eyes, short black hair, and a blank look in his eyes. I chatted with him for about 2 minutes, just small talk about the weather and things like that, nothing particularly memorable or interesting. Then I said goodbye and went home. But little did I know that that one moment would be the beginning of something that would make me feel genuinely scared. About 4 or 5 months passed and I hadn't seen him again, but one day while I was shopping with a friend, while we were chatting, she suddenly became very quiet and stepped back a little, looking behind me. I turned around and saw this guy, who must have been at least 5 feet tall, standing out above me, less than 6 inches from my body. He greeted me and told me that he remembered me from that day in December. Then he asked me for my number. Being so young and having never experienced this type of interaction before, I told him that I didn't have my number memorized, but that I would write his and send him a message later. I half shook my phone at him, pointing to my then boyfriend, whose picture was my wallpaper, making sure to say, "Oh look, that's my boyfriend," to the guy, hoping he would get the hint, but I had no luck. He gave me his number, which I immediately blocked without letting him get mine. He came very close and said in a low voice that whatever I sent him by message was for my eyes only. At this point, I began to feel genuinely uncomfortable. I said, "Yes, sure. It was nice to talk to you, but we have to buy again," and grabbed my friend and dragged her away, looking at her in a panic and asking her why she hadn't helped me. Apparently, he also scared her by getting so close to me and she didn't know what to do. I want to make it clear that I'm not exactly a small girl. I'm 6 feet tall and have a solid build. I can certainly take care of myself and rarely feel intimidated or small in the presence of anyone, male or female, but this guy made me feel very small and scared. In the months that followed, it made me feel truly scared. I was hoping that creepy interaction would be the last time I saw him, but sadly it wasn't the case. After that initial encounter with him and that creepy thing about the message that was for my eyes only, it seemed like I ran into him every time I went to the store, no matter what checkout line I was in. He always seemed to appear near the end. When I had finished shopping and every time I was in the store, I noticed him out of the corner of my eye looking at me, no matter what area I was in. One time I even saw him following me to my car. At the time, I was too scared and decided to say something to the managers. After I informed them of what was happening, they assured me that they would tell him not to talk to me. After that, he wouldn't talk to me, but I kept seeing him following me around the store at a distance every time I went there. It got so bad and I felt so scared that I started to get scared to go to this store. But I'm one of those stubborn people who refuse to be bullied by someone to the point of not doing anything. I was hoping that maybe it was a coincidence that he was following me. After all, it was a pretty big store and maybe I just had things to do that matched the area I was shopping in. So I started paying close attention to my surroundings. When I started paying real attention, I realized that literally every time I was there, I was constantly noticing it in the areas of the store I was in. During my last encounter with him, I went to the store to buy only 2 or 3 items I needed for dinner that night, and I saw him for the first time standing outside the store. When I arrived with my back to me, I ran quickly inside, hoping he wouldn't see me. Unfortunately, a few minutes later I saw him at the back of the store, and with the items in hand, I immediately headed to the front. As soon as I got close to the checkout, I hid behind one of the shelves and carefully looked at the front of the store to see if it appeared, and it did. I saw how he looked up and down at the box, and when he didn't see me there, I saw him come outside. At this point, I quickly ran to the nearest cashier, paid for my items, and poked my head out the door to look for it. I didn't see him there right away, so I started heading towards where I had parked. I had parked far away near the side of the store where there was a row of other stores and restaurants. As I walked to my car, I noticed that I saw him standing near the entrance through which I had first entered the store, so I ducked behind a column immediately, hoping he wouldn't see me. I watched him carefully from behind the column, and as he scanned the parking lot, he obviously couldn't find me. After a minute or two, he started walking towards the direction of the parking lot, so I took that opportunity to run to my car as soon as it was far enough away for me to feel safe. As soon as I got to my car, I locked the doors, and to my horror, when I looked up, he was standing there about 5 yards from my car with the shopping cart in front of him. I knew he had followed me, and he knew I knew. I firmly believe he chased me, and when I got to my car, he grabbed the nearest cart to make it look like he was picking them up from the parking lot. I remember feeling absolutely terrified at the time. I went home and immediately told my grandfather what had happened. I started crying and shaking, and my grandfather told me to get in the car and we were going to figure this out. He and I went to the store in his car, and he took me inside and demanded that we talk to the managers right away. When the managers arrived at customer service, he asked me to tell them what had been going on. My grandfather demanded that they make sure I was left alone or that I would get the police involved. The managers swore over and over again that they would take care of it. As far as I know, he wasn't fired right away because my friend who had first met him with me when this all started told me that she saw him from time to time when she was there alone, but every time I went with her, she never saw him. I firmly believe that he knew when I was there alone this time. Instead of following me, he avoided me. Eventually, everyone who knew about the situation stopped seeing him there, so I think he may have been fired or left that store. Either way, I haven't had any problems since, but never in my life have I felt as scared of another human being as I did that day, watching them make eye contact with me in the parking lot as I closed my doors. It still makes my hair stand on end to think that he was watching me so closely every time I walked into the store, that he could follow me or avoid me.